You built that thing here? Looks like scrap metal to me.
Take a good look.
No way. These numbers can't be real.
I tested it for 10 years.
You're sitting on land worth a fortune. May I speak with Warren Tate? Speaking. Mr. Tate, we'd like to discuss your engine.
We are prepared to offer $50 million for the initial development phase. I understand. 50 million?
We can help manufacture it. We should be partners.
You didn't believe in the engine. You only believe in the money. I built this without you.
Preston Hale laughed out loud the moment he saw it. A blocky, oil-streaked engine sitting in the middle of a battered garage on the east side of Detroit, surrounded by cracked concrete walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed like tired insects. He turned to the investors flanking him, and the laughter passed through the group like a current, easy and automatic, the way ridicule always travels when powerful men feel safe. The man standing beside the engine was Warren Tate, 39 years old, black, wearing a faded work shirt with grease so deep in the fabric it had become part of the weave, and he said nothing. He picked up a bound folder of test records, set it on the workbench without ceremony, and let it sit there like a question no one had thought to ask. Preston called the engine junk, called it the daydream of a broke mechanic, called it what men like him always call things they cannot immediately price. But 30 minutes later, the old landline bolted to the garage wall rang with a sound that cut through the laughter like a blade. The caller was Washington, and the White House wanted to purchase the testing rights to that engine for $50 million. Don't laugh at the invention sitting in an old garage, because sometimes the future of an entire nation starts exactly there. Tate Auto Works occupied a narrow lot on a block that Detroit had not yet decided whether to save or abandon, wedged between a hardware store with bars on the windows and a vacant lot where someone had planted sunflowers the previous summer in a small, stubborn act of optimism. The garage itself was unremarkable from the outside. A hand-painted sign, 2 bay doors, a rack of used tires leaning against the cinder block wall like sleeping men. But inside it ran with a precision that the neighborhood had come to trust implicitly and completely. Warren Tate had operated it for 11 years with one rule: charge what people could actually pay. He fixed alternators, brakelets, transmissions, and timing belts for the teachers and nursing aides and postal workers who could not afford dealership rates and could not afford to miss a day of work because a car had failed them at 6 in the morning. He was known, among the regulars, for a particular talent that no certification program had ever tried to teach. He could stand beside a running engine, tilt his head slightly, and name the fault within 30 seconds with accuracy that his customers found almost supernatural, but that Warren himself described as simple arithmetic. Every engine spoke a language, and most people just never took the time to listen. The back section of the garage was separated from the service bays by a steel door that Warren kept locked, and most of his regular customers assumed it was storage. It was not storage. Behind that door, under lights Warren had wired himself from a salvaged electrical panel, sat the project that had consumed every spare hour of the past decade. A hybrid combustion engine assembled almost entirely from salvage components, stripped-down donor engines, precision-machined parts Warren had either fabricated himself or sourced from suppliers who had no idea what they were contributing to. The design was unconventional in ways that would have made a classically trained engineer uncomfortable at first glance, because Warren had not been trained classically. He had been trained by failure, by iteration, by reading every engineering text he could find in used bookstores and public libraries, and by watching the machines in front of him until they revealed their logic. He had applied for 3 engineering programs over the years and been told, each time, that his financial situation made admission impossible, not his intelligence, a distinction the institution seemed to consider polite rather than tragic. Warren had considered it neither. He had gone back to the garage and kept working. The engine used a regenerative load management system that Warren had developed through roughly 40 failed prototypes. a design that allowed the combustion cycle to compensate automatically when electrical input dropped, meaning the machine could sustain output under conditions where a conventional hybrid would stall or shut down entirely. He had tested it in Michigan winters, in simulated flooding conditions, using a drainage hose and a plastic tarp at temperature extremes that commercial test facilities charged thousands of dollars per hour to replicate. He logged every result in composition notebooks stacked along the wall in chronological order, the handwriting small and exact, the margins full of calculations that followed the logic through to endpoints other engineers had not pursued. The engine was not perfect, and Warren knew precisely where its imperfections lived. But it was functional, it was durable, and it solved a problem that the major manufacturers had addressed only in the luxury segment, leaving an entire category of working vehicles, ambulances, fire response units, field rescue equipment, still dependent on combustion architectures that dated to the previous century. Fallon Briggs arrived on a Tuesday morning to conduct a third-party mechanical inspection on a customer's sedan, which was a routine enough job that she had scheduled it between two other appointments and expected to be done in under 2 hours. Fallon ran an independent certification practice and had the kind of technical background that made her methodical rather than fast. She checked what the paperwork said, and then she checked what the machine said, and she had learned over 15 years that those two things frequently disagreed. She finished the sedan inspection, made a note in her report, and was walking back through the garage when the steel door at the rear happened to be ajar, left open because Warren had been moving equipment and hadn't yet returned to close it. She stopped. She looked at the engine on the test stand. She walked over without asking, because a machine that looked like that occupied a different category than private property. It was the kind of object that demanded examination the way an unusual geological formation demanded a second look. She studied the load management configuration for several minutes without speaking, and then she found Warren in the front bay and asked him, quietly, who had designed it. He told her he had. She told him, equally quietly, that the thermal cycling profile she had just observed in the secondary chamber was not something she had seen in any commercial hybrid architecture she had evaluated in 15 years of certification work, and that this was not a neutral observation. Fallon had a contact inside a federal strategic technology assessment program, a program that reviewed independent engineering developments for potential applications in public safety and defense infrastructure, and she told Warren that if his test data held up under review, it was worth submitting. Warren was not dismissive, but he was careful, in the way that men who have had ideas taken from them tend to be careful, and he said he would think about it. Fallon did not push him. She left her card on the workbench and told him the door was not permanent. Programs like this moved on timelines, and windows closed. Warren looked at the card for a long time after she left, turning it slowly between his fingers, and then he set it on top of the notebook nearest to hand and went back to work. Preston Hale arrived in Detroit on a morning in early fall when the city looked almost like its promotional photographs. The light, golden, old brick catching it well, the river visible in a way that suggested possibility. He was there on genuine business. Hale Motors was expanding its retail footprint, and his real estate team had identified a corridor on the east side as undervalued and strategically positioned. The lot that Tate Auto Works occupied was on a list of 12 properties. Preston was not the kind of executive who involved himself in acquisition details, but he had developed a preference for handling conversations personally when the owner might be difficult. Because his presence alone tended to accelerate negotiations his subordinates had failed to close. He came with Meredith Langston, who managed communications for Hale Motors, and 2 investment partners who wanted to see the properties firsthand. They arrived at the garage in a car that cost more than most of the block's residents earned in 5 years, and no one in the car registered this. Warren was under a vehicle when they walked in. He rolled out and stood without wiping his hands, which was a choice Meredith noticed and Preston did not. Preston introduced himself with the assurance of a man who had been recognized on sight. For so many years he had forgotten what it felt like not to be known. Warren said he knew who he was, The offer was presented as an opportunity, a below-market price for the property, with the framing that the area was declining and accepting now was preferable to a harder negotiation later. Warren listened without interrupting, which Preston interpreted as receptiveness, and which was actually the stillness of a man who has heard this argument before and knows exactly where it ends. When Preston finished, Warren said he was not selling, not because the price was wrong, though it was, but because the garage provided affordable repairs to people in the neighborhood who had no alternative, and the lot was not a commodity to him. Preston said Warren was being sentimental in a way that would cost him, and that the market did not reward sentiment. It was Meredith who saw it first. The steel door at the rear of the garage had been left open again, and through it the engine on the test stand was visible. She said nothing, but Preston followed her line of sight, and his face did something that Meredith would remember later as the last moment of the afternoon when his confidence was still entirely intact. He walked to the door. He looked at the engine for a moment. Then he laughed, a full, relaxed laugh, the laugh of a man who has just been given unexpected confirmation of something he already believed, and he turned to the investors and made a gesture that included the engine and the garage and Warren and everything in the room in a single, sweeping dismissal. He asked Warren, still smiling, whether he was planning to save the world with a pile of scrap metal. His voice had the warmth of a man who considered himself good-humored. Warren looked at him steadily and said, "No. I'm just planning to finish what you people stopped trying to do." Preston was not a man who walked away from a scene when the scene still had somewhere to go, and so he did not leave. He told Warren with the patience of someone explaining something to a child that if the engine were genuinely worth anything, there would be a simple way to demonstrate it, present it, explain it, defend it in front of people who understood engineering. The implication was that Warren could not. One of the investors had his phone out, held low at his side in the way that people hold phones when they want the recording to be unobtrusive, and Warren noted it with the peripheral awareness of a man who has lived his entire life in rooms where he was being evaluated for performance rather than invited for conversation. He did not ask the man to put the phone away. He pulled up a stool, set the bound test folder on the bench between them, and began. The fuel consumption differential was the first point. Under equivalent load conditions, the engine produced a consumption rate measurably lower than the benchmark hybrid architectures currently deployed in commercial rescue vehicles, a gap that compounded significantly over extended operational periods of the kind common in disaster response scenarios. The second point was operational continuity. Because the load management system compensated for electrical interruption, the engine did not require the stable electrical environment that current hybrid units depended on, which meant it could function in flooded zones, in earthquake rubble, in any of the post-disaster landscapes where conventional hybrid vehicles had failed rescue operations by shutting down at the moment of maximum need. The third point was maintenance architecture. Warren had designed the service access specifically with the repair infrastructure of low-resource environments in mind, which meant the engine could be maintained by a reasonably skilled mechanic without specialized equipment, a consideration that the commercial manufacturers had not prioritized because their customers had service contracts. Preston cut in before Warren had reached the fourth point. He said that the engineering establishment did not take seriously the theoretical designs of people without formal credentials, and that no one in a position to fund serious development would look at this garage and this man and see a viable investment. He said it with the measured calm of a person stating facts, but the facts were not facts. They were assumptions dressed as facts, which is a different thing entirely. Fallon stepped forward from where she had been standing near the doorway. She had returned to the garage that morning to follow up on her earlier visit, and had walked in during the presentation, and said, clearly and without any particular emotion, that the test data in that folder was not theoretical, and that she had reviewed a portion of it and found it structurally sound. Preston turned to look at her with the expression of a man encountering interference from an unexpected direction. He said, recovering easily, "If this was worth anything, Detroit wouldn't have left it sitting in a garage like this." The room was quiet for a moment. Warren closed the test folder. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He picked up Fallon's card from the workbench where it had sat for 2 days, handed it back to her with a look that communicated something they did not need to speak aloud. And then he walked to the filing cabinet in the corner and removed a second copy of the complete test data package, the comprehensive version, including thermal readings, load variance charts, the video documentation of the 300-hour continuous run, and the failure analysis reports from the prototypes that had not worked, and gave it to Fallon without ceremony. She took it and left. Warren turned back to the room, to Preston and his investors, and the camera that was still running, and said nothing further. He had already said the only thing that mattered. Preston spent the next hour continuing to make the case for the property purchase, his energy undiminished, his certainty apparently intact. He worked through a sequence of arguments, the neighborhood trajectory, the development timeline, the realistic alternatives Warren had in a tightening market, with the fluency of a man who had run this playbook many times on many people and found it reliable. Meredith watched from near the bay door with the slightly detached attention of someone performing a professional function while privately revising her assessment of the situation. She had covered dozens of acquisition conversations for Hale Motors, and she had developed, over those years, a sensitivity to the moment when a negotiation was no longer moving toward the outcome that had been planned for it, and she was beginning to feel that moment approaching in the current room like a change in air pressure. Fallon, across the city, had not gone home. She had gone directly to her office, spread the data package across her work table, and spent 40 minutes reviewing it, with the focused attention she normally reserved for formal certification assignments. What she found confirmed what she had suspected 2 days earlier. The thermal management design was not a refinement of existing hybrid architecture. It was a structural departure from it, a different solution to the same problem, and one that had implications for operational environments that the existing architectures had not adequately addressed. She had a former colleague, a mechanical systems engineer named Davis, who now worked in a federal technology review capacity, and she had his direct number. Because they had stayed in contact after a conference 3 years prior, where they had disagreed productively about load compensation theory for nearly 2 hours, and found each other interesting afterward. She called him. She described the data without editorializing. He asked 2 questions, then told her to send him everything. The data package arrived in Davis's inbox at 2:47 in the afternoon. He opened it, looked at the thermal cycling graphs, and then picked up his own phone and called the assessment team lead. The assessment team lead called the program director. The program director had standing authorization for a rapid escalation review when independent technology submissions met a specific threshold of operational relevance, and the Warren Tate engine data met it. The escalation protocol moved up the chain at a speed that is specific to government programs when the stakes are not bureaucratic but practical, when the thing being evaluated is not a contract or a policy position, but a machine that could keep rescue workers alive in a disaster. Back in the garage, Preston had shifted his approach. He was no longer pressing for a sale. He had read the room well enough to understand that direct pressure was not moving Warren, and was instead speaking in the more expansive register of a man describing a larger vision, the kind of vision in which Warren's situation improved significantly, and Preston's interests were also served, and the alignment between these 2 outcomes was presented as natural rather than constructed. Warren stood with his arms crossed, not hostile but not convinced, watching Preston speak with the attention of a man listening to a machine he is trying to diagnose. He said he would need to think about any proposal carefully, and that he had a lawyer who reviewed all agreements. Preston said, of course, naturally there was no rush, though everything in his posture suggested that there was. He checked his watch. He mentioned a dinner across town. He implied that this was not a permanent offer. The old telephone on the wall of the garage rang once, then again, with the flat mechanical sound of a device that had been ringing in that room since before any of the people present had arrived in it. Warren crossed the garage and picked it up. The voice on the other end was measured and deliberate, the voice of a person who had spent years delivering significant information in circumstances where the delivery itself needed to signal the weight of what was being said without overstating it. The man identified himself as Royce Calloway, representing the Federal Strategic Technology Program. He said that his team had received the submitted test data and had reviewed it on an expedited basis. He asked whether Warren Tate was the sole designer of record for the engine described in the documentation, and whether the design had been submitted for preliminary intellectual property protection. Warren said yes to both questions, in the same quiet voice he used for everything. Preston, standing 10 feet away, heard the professional register of the call, the institutional cadence, the precision of the questions, and went still in the way that large animals go still when something in the environment changes. Royce said that the engine design appeared to have significant alignment with the operational requirements of a federal rescue vehicle program currently in development, particularly with regard to the electrical independence specifications that had proved difficult to meet with currently available commercial technology. He said his team wanted to discuss a preliminary development and testing agreement. He gave the proposed figure clearly and without softening. $50 million for the initial phase, covering prototype development, field testing, and intellectual property protection within the agreement's scope, with Warren retaining full ownership of the underlying design. The garage became very quiet. One of the investors, who had still been making notes on a small pad, stopped writing. Fallon, who had returned to the garage in the preceding 10 minutes after sending the data and had been standing near the rear door, without speaking, put her hand over her mouth and looked at the floor and then at the ceiling. Preston Hale did not move for a moment that was long enough to be perceptible to everyone in the room. Royce continued, saying that the program had a strong preference for moving quickly given the development timeline, and that he would like to arrange a direct meeting. He said the team could be in Detroit that afternoon if Warren was available. He asked whether there were any preliminary barriers to a meeting. Warren said there were none. He said he would need his attorney present for any formal discussion. Royce said that was expected and appropriate. There was a brief exchange of logistics, confirmation of the address, the estimated arrival time, and then Royce said, in a tone that was professional, but carried a quality that was not entirely impersonal, "Mr. Tate, the people in this program want to meet with you today." Warren thanked him, set the phone down, and turned to face the room. He looked at no one in particular. He picked up the test folder and straightened the edges against the workbench. Preston was looking at him with an expression that had not yet resolved into anything recognizable. The face of a man processing a rapid recalculation of a situation he had believed, 30 minutes earlier, that he understood completely. The recalculation, when it completed, produced results entirely predictable to anyone who understood Preston Hale. He became helpful. He said a federal agreement of this scale, required manufacturing infrastructure an independent inventor could not provide alone, and that Hale Motors had precisely the production systems the program needed. He said this as though he were doing Warren a service, as though the obstacle Warren faced was logistical, rather than the fact that the man speaking had spent the last hour calling his invention scrap. He said he could have his team reach out to the federal contact directly, that he had relationships in Washington, that he could move quickly. He moved across the garage with the energy of a man who has decided the winning position in a game he thought he was watching has been available to him all along. Warren looked at him with an expression that was not angry, something quieter and more final than anger. Fallon had stepped outside briefly and made a call, and Sterling Quinn arrived at the garage 22 minutes later. Sterling was 66 years old, thin, dressed in a gray suit that was not expensive but was extremely well maintained, and he moved with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had been practicing law long enough to have stopped being in a hurry about anything. He was Warren's attorney, and had been for 9 years. He had helped Warren file the preliminary intellectual property protections on the engine design 8 months prior, in a process that Warren had paid for in installments because the fees were significant relative to his income, and he had paid them anyway because he understood what protection meant. Sterling confirmed, in response to Warren's question and to the room at large, that the design documentation was covered under provisional protections filed with the appropriate federal office, and that no third party had any claim on the design without a formal agreement executed with Warren's knowledge and consent. Preston offered to purchase the design rights on the spot. He named a number that was significantly lower than $50 million, framed it as expedient, a clean transaction, fast, no government complexity, no bureaucratic timeline. Warren said no. Meredith, standing near the wall, said quietly and without looking at Preston, "There's video." Preston turned toward her, and she met his eyes briefly and then looked away. One of the investors had put his phone away, but the recording that had been running during the earlier presentation was already made, and Meredith knew, with the professional certainty of someone whose job was to understand how information traveled, that it existed in the world now in a way that could not be undone. Preston made one more approach, softer, more reasonable in tone, suggesting a partnership. Hale Motors as manufacturing partner, Warren retaining creative control, the federal program proceeding with Hale's industrial backing. Warren listened to the full proposal. Then he said, "You didn't want the engine. You want to own the thing you just spent an hour laughing at." Preston opened his mouth and closed it. There was nothing useful available to him in that moment, no argument, no reframe, no version of his usual fluency, and the room held the silence without anyone moving to fill it. The engine had been 10 years in the making, but the 10 years were not what they appeared from the outside. From the outside, and this was the version that Preston's world operated on, the version where credentials and institutions and the visible markers of seriousness were the evidence. Warren Tate was an autodidact working in a garage, and this was a description that had been used to dismiss him so many times that it had nearly become true in his own mind, nearly become the ceiling he organized his ambitions below. What was true was simpler and more complicated at the same time. His father, Raymond Tate, had worked for 22 years as a machinist in a Detroit manufacturing plant, a man of precision and patience who had understood mechanical systems in the deep, embodied way that comes from decades of contact with actual machines rather than theoretical models of them. Raymond had lost his job when the plant consolidated operations and moved the work to a facility 3 states away. A decision announced in a memo that took 42 seconds to read and ended a quarter-century of employment for 114 people, none of whom were consulted, and none of whom were given more than 90 days' notice. Warren was 17 when the plant closed. He watched his father, who was not a man given to outward despair, become quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quietness, a silence that had weight in it. The family managed. Raymond found other work, slower, lower, further from what he had been built for, and Warren finished school and began working in garages because it was work he could get, and work that connected him. In some way he could feel but not yet name, to the logic his father had spent a lifetime practicing. He had tried to go to school for it, tried the formal path that was supposed to convert aptitude into credential into opportunity, and found that the path was not actually available to him at the price it was advertised. And so he had stopped trying to walk it, and had built something instead. The engine was not an abstract project. It was an argument. It was a response to the specific conditions Warren had observed his entire life. The way that heavy-duty working vehicles in poor communities ran old, ran broken, ran on delayed maintenance, because the sophisticated repair infrastructure that modern engines required was not available in those communities the way it was in wealthier ones. He had watched ambulances break down. He had read about flood rescues, where the vehicles could not operate in standing water. He had understood, from years of practical contact with machinery, that the gap between what rescue infrastructure needed and what the commercial market was building for it was large, and that no one was addressing it because the commercial market was not primarily interested in rescue infrastructure. It was interested in vehicles that wealthy people bought, which was a different category of problem. The engine was designed for that gap. Durable, low maintenance, electrically independent, suitable for the ambulances and field rescue units and emergency generators that the working world actually depended on. Every major manufacturer he had approached, in the years when he had still been approaching major manufacturers, had declined. The reasons given varied. No formal partnership, no institutional affiliation, no track record in a laboratory setting. But the underlying message had been consistent, and Warren had received it clearly. He had gone back to the garage and kept working. Fallon, reviewing the timeline of failures and revisions in the test notebooks, understood for the first time the full shape of what she was looking at. Not just an engine, but a decade of refusals converted into proof. Royce Calloway arrived at 4:15 in the afternoon with 3 engineers from the Federal Assessment Program, each carrying different measurement equipment and none introducing themselves with job titles, only names. They moved through the garage with the efficient attention of people who had done field evaluations before and understood the difference between a polished demonstration environment and an actual working space, and they showed no particular reaction to the fact that the environment was a garage in East Detroit rather than a laboratory. Preston was still in the building, which Royce noted and did not address. Meredith had taken a position near the rear and was no longer performing any professional function. She was simply watching. Warren mounted the engine in the bed of an older rescue-rated truck, connected his diagnostic monitoring system, and ran through the startup sequence with the unhurried focus of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The federal engineers set up their own monitoring equipment in parallel, so that when the data arrived, it would come from 2 independent sources simultaneously. The first test measured standard load performance under simulated road conditions. The truck running against a hydraulic resistance system Warren had rigged from a winch and a load cell, a solution improvised enough that one of the engineers photographed it with an expression suggesting he would describe it to colleagues later. The engine ran clean. Fuel consumption came in at the levels Warren's data had projected. Lower than benchmark by a margin, the engineers marked quickly, with the speed of people who recognized a significant number. The second test simulated electrical system interruption. Warren cut the primary power feed mid-cycle, while the engine was under load. The engine compensated within the load management cycle and continued running. One engineer said something low to the one beside him. The other nodded. The third test ran 90 minutes, and through all of it the thermal readings stayed within the envelope Warren's documentation predicted. Preston stood against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching the data accumulate with an expression that had moved past doubt into something resembling understanding, a slow recognition of what had happened to him over the past several hours. When the final test concluded, Royce stood in the middle of the garage and looked at his team, and each of them gave him a small, confirmed nod in sequence. He turned to Warren and said, clearly and for the benefit of everyone present, "This is not a garage project anymore. This is technology that needs to be protected and developed." Preston moved first, because Preston always moved first. It was a reflex, the forward motion instinct of a man whose success had been built on being at the table before other people had finished standing up. He addressed Royce directly, not Warren, which was a choice, and he described the manufacturing partnership he could offer with the fluency of a prepared pitch, which was not accidental. Preston had been constructing this offer in his head for the past hour while the tests ran, reconfiguring the situation in real time. Hale Motors had production lines, supply chains, quality control infrastructure, federal contractor relationships. He could have a prototype in production within a timeline that an independent operator simply could not match. He presented this as a practical reality rather than a negotiating position, which was the version of truth that served him best. Warren waited for him to finish. Then he asked Preston, in the mild voice he used for everything, what the proposal meant for Detroit. Specifically, where the manufacturing facility would be located, who would be hired to work in it, and what the technology licensing structure meant for the organizations that needed rescue vehicles and could not pay premium prices for them. Preston answered with the language of corporate commitment. Investment in the region, community benefit, job creation. Language Warren had heard enough times to recognize as the part of the pitch that occupied the space where specifics would otherwise need to go. Warren listed his requirements plainly. The pilot manufacturing facility, located in Detroit, staffed primarily with workers from the city, a technical apprenticeship program attached to the facility for young workers from the surrounding neighborhoods, and a licensing structure that did not create monopoly pricing in the rescue vehicle market. He said these were not positions he was willing to negotiate from. They were conditions. Preston laughed briefly, the way he laughed when he was recalibrating rather than amused, and said Warren was conflating philanthropy with commerce, which was a way of saying that the conditions were naive without having to use that word. Royce said, from the other side of the room, that several of the conditions Warren had described were in fact consistent with the program's public benefit requirements, and that he would want to see them incorporated into the formal agreement structure. Sterling had been writing notes throughout the conversation, unhurried and thorough, and he said quietly that any access to the design documentation would require a confidentiality and non-compete framework to be signed before it was provided, and that this would apply to any party in the room. He said this to the room rather than to Preston, but the message was specific. Preston looked at the door, and then at the test screens, and then at Royce, and then at Warren. He understood, with the clarity of a man who reads situations accurately even when the reading is unwelcome, that the $50 million agreement being assembled in this garage was not going to include Hale Motors as a partner, unless Warren decided it should. And Warren had made no such decision, and showed no sign of making one. The commercial logic that had worked for Preston in every prior negotiation of his career, the leverage of resources, the pressure of timing, the weight of institutional credibility, had been neutralized completely by the fact that the asset in question was Warren's, and Warren's alone, protected and documented, and confirmed in front of federal witnesses, and the man who owned it was not afraid of him. Preston gathered his group with a gesture and walked toward the bay doors. He said nothing directly to Warren as he passed. Warren did not call after him. The investors followed. Meredith was the last to move, and she paused at the door and looked back at the garage, at Warren, at the engine on its test stand, at the federal engineers still reviewing their readouts. And something moved across her face that was private enough that she turned away before anyone could read it clearly. The story of the engine lived in a series of composition notebooks and a sequence of failures precise enough to constitute a map. The first real attempt at the load compensation system had destroyed 2 donor engines and taught him the boundary conditions he had been working from incorrect assumptions about. The second attempt ran for 11 hours, then failed at a weld point, and Warren spent 2 weeks determining exactly why before continuing. The third ran for 40 hours before a thermal issue in the secondary chamber ended the cycle, and the documentation of that failure contained, buried in the heat readings, the insight that reoriented the entire design. A pattern Warren noticed only because he reviewed every data log line by line rather than summarizing and moving on. The machine on the test stand was the 37th configuration of the core design and the 4th physical build, and it ran the way it ran not because Warren was a genius in the sudden, inexplicable sense, but because he was the kind that rarely got documented, the kind that showed up for the 37th time after 36 failures, adjusted the variables, and ran the test again. He had done this in a garage because garages were what he had access to, and without institutional backing because institutions had declined to back him, and alone because the specific problem he was solving required the kind of patient singular attention that only one person who cared enough to stay could give it. The applications Warren cared most about were not the ones that made headlines. He had thought about the ambulance that broke down during flooding 2 years prior. 3 paragraphs in the local news, forgotten by the following week, but a life lost in a way a functioning vehicle would not have cost. He had thought about disaster shelter generators running on delivery chains that collapsed exactly when the disaster was worst, and about communities that received the oldest, most failure-prone emergency equipment because procurement systems allocated by institutional priority, not need. The engine was not a product in Preston's sense of the word. It was an infrastructure argument built in metal and wiring, an answer to a question the commercial market had decided was not profitable enough to ask. Royce and Warren and Sterling spent 3 hours in the garage that evening, after the federal engineers had filed their field reports electronically while seated at Warren's workbench. The agreement was not a sale. Warren had been clear about this from the first exchange, and Sterling had structured every conversation around it. The engine and its underlying design belonged to Warren Tate, and no agreement would transfer that ownership. What was being negotiated was a development and testing license, under which the federal program would fund the next phase of prototype development, field testing, and manufacturing preparation in exchange for a non-exclusive government use license within the program's defined scope. $50 million for the development phase. Patent protection costs absorbed by the program. Warren retaining all commercial rights outside the government use license. Fallon was asked whether she would serve as independent technical oversight lead for the certification process, and she accepted without deliberation, because some opportunities arrived fully formed, and this was one. Sterling worked through the preliminary term sheet with Royce clause by clause, asking questions detailed enough that Royce sometimes had to note them for follow-up rather than answering immediately, which Sterling treated as the expected rhythm of proper due diligence. When they reached the manufacturing location provision, Warren said Detroit, and Royce said the program had no objection. When they reached the licensing restriction preventing monopoly pricing in the rescue vehicle market, Sterling and Royce spent 20 minutes on the legal architecture to protect that intent, and arrived at language both considered durable. Warren signed the Memorandum of Understanding at 9:14 in the evening, at the workbench where he had logged every test result, under the fluorescent lights that had buzzed in that room for 11 years. Outside, a news van had arrived, someone had talked, or the investor's recording had already traveled, and a reporter was setting up a camera. Meredith was standing some distance from the van with her phone in her hand, not calling anyone, just standing there in the cool September air. Preston was gone. He had left 2 hours before, without ceremony. The news traveled through Detroit in the particular way that good news about one of its own traveled in a city that had been told too many times to expect less. Fast, warm, in the half-disbelieving tone of people who want it to be true and are checking the fact of it repeatedly against the feeling of it. Mechanics who had sent customers to Washburn over the years found out through the community radio station. The school where Warren's younger sister taught heard about it before the story had a second source. The hardware store owner next door, who had been watching the federal vehicles park in front of the garage for hours and had been too careful to ask, came over at 8 in the morning with coffee and a loaf of bread from the Caribbean bakery 2 blocks down, and said nothing but congratulations in a voice that was thick. Warren did not relocate. He did not hire a publicist or retain a speaker's agent, or allow any of the intermediaries who contacted him to schedule conversations that would have converted the moment into a personal brand. He expanded the garage. The service bays stayed as they were, because the neighborhood still needed affordable repairs, but the locked back section grew. He framed out 2 additional rooms, wired them himself, and brought in equipment for the next phase of prototype work. The hiring came next, and it was the part that mattered most to Warren in ways he did not say publicly, but that Fallon understood from watching him conduct the interviews. He recruited from the community, mechanics from the neighborhood, young engineers who had trained at community college programs and then found the industry doors closed to them. People whose technical knowledge had been accumulated in garages and side projects and under-resourced classrooms rather than in the prestigious pipelines that the manufacturers preferred. He hired 12 people in the first month. He hired 8 more when the federal funding landed. He did not give speeches about it. He showed people where the equipment was and what the problem was and what the data looked like so far, and then he asked them what they thought. Preston Hale became, in the weeks following the signing, a figure in a particular kind of story that public life creates periodically. The confident man who was publicly wrong at the exact moment his wrongness could be documented. The recording captured Preston's laughter in the garage and his dismissal of both the engine and the man behind it. And it circulated with the thoroughness of something that captures an essential truth about a person. Hale Motors issued a statement that attempted the careful work of neither confirming nor fully distancing the company from Preston's behavior, which satisfied almost no one. The company's institutional investors asked questions at the next quarterly call that the statement had not prepared Preston to answer, and the stock moved accordingly. Meredith Langston joined the Tate Mobility Lab 3 weeks after her resignation as communications director, on the mutual understanding that her role was transparency, not narrative management, but the straightforward work of making sure what was actually happening was clearly communicated to the people it concerned. She had one conversation with Warren before accepting. She told him she had been in the room and had not spoken up the way she should have. Warren said that seemed like a reasonable thing to want to fix and hired her. Warren replaced the hand-painted sign outside the building with a new one, cut from aluminum by a fabricator in the neighborhood who had done metal work for the automotive industry before the contraction, and who did the job at cost and was proud to. The sign read, Tate Mobility Lab. 6 months after the signing, the first field prototype was ready. It had been built in the expanded back section of the lab by Warren and 9 of the people he had hired, and it was mounted in a rescue-rated truck that had been provided by the federal program for exactly this purpose. The field test was scheduled at a training facility outside the city, and Warren drove the truck himself to the site in the early morning, while the sky was still that deep gray blue that precedes actual dawn, the city quiet around him, and the engine beneath him running with the evenness he had spent 10 years learning to achieve. Royce was at the facility with the assessment team. Fallon had the certification protocols printed and bound, cross-referenced with the Federal Rescue Vehicle Standards and the independent data from the garage tests, and she ran the field evaluation with the methodical thoroughness that had made her reputation, calling each test phase in sequence and recording the results with the impartiality of someone who would have reported a failure with exactly the same care she was now giving to the confirmations. The engine met every benchmark. In the electrical interruption sequence, the test that mattered most, the simulation of the condition that had ended rescue operations in previous disasters, it did not waver. The truck continued moving. The systems continued functioning. The gap that Warren had spent 10 years building a bridge across held the weight. Royce confirmed that the second phase of the program would proceed, which meant full production planning, expanded field deployment, and the formal transfer of the prototype design to the manufacturing preparation process. He said this standing in the parking lot of the testing facility, with Warren and the mechanics and engineers who had built the thing standing around him, all of them in work clothes and none of them in the position they were supposed to occupy, according to the logic of how these moments usually arrived. Warren stood for a while after the team dispersed, looking at the truck. He looked at it the way he looked at engines, with the attention of someone reading rather than admiring, checking for what it was still telling him, what the data still held. Behind him, toward the facility building, a young engineering student from the apprenticeship program came over. 20 years old, from a neighborhood 3 blocks from the lab, the kind of young person who had been told his options were limited so many times that he had begun to construct his life around the edges of that belief without quite accepting it. He had been on the build team for the prototype. He asked Warren, with the directness of someone who is still young enough to ask things directly, what credentials a person needed to become an inventor. Warren turned and looked at him for a moment before answering. He said, enough curiosity to keep learning, enough stubbornness to keep failing, and enough self-respect not to sell your idea to the first person who offers you a price. The young man nodded, holding that, turning it over the way you turn over something given to you, whose full weight you will only understand later. 6 months before, Preston Hale had stood in a battered garage in East Detroit and laughed at an engine built from salvaged parts by a man with grease on his hands and no letters after his name. 30 minutes later, Washington had called with $50 million. And standing there in the early light of a fall morning, Watching the truck that carried that engine prepare for another test run, Detroit understood something it had always known but rarely been shown this plainly. Genius does not always arrive wearing a laboratory coat. Sometimes it stands in the smell of motor oil, hands darkened to the knuckles, quietly building the future out of the things the powerful had already decided were worth nothing.